Welcome back, Taylor. Um,
Thank you, John.
Today, we are talking about practical examples of socialism. I guess this is something we didn't really get into in depth in episode 80, and that was some of the feedback I got. And so sometimes I consider what people say.
Yes, and I read some of those things too. I mean, I think I read most of them on Facebook at least.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was basically where we got the feedback.
Yeah.
So my question is, what are some countries that you would identify as exemplars of democratic socialism?
Yeah, so I did, more research into this, and I talked to a few friends who are more advanced on this topic. And the thing is that you don't really have countries who are completely democratic socialists. You have countries that have prominent democratic socialist parties, but no country is a single system. Though, I mean, I'll just try to answer the question initially without trying to reframe everything, I guess. And we wrote out some notes that I'm going to kind of like be vaguely following, but we'll just kind of let the conversation be its thing and reference the notes probably. But one example is Portugal, actually. Right now in Portugal, and for like the last 7 or 8 years, it's been in Europe and most of the world, maybe Canada as well, this like coalition governments. So you vote for how many seats you get, and then
Right. Yep.
yeah, that's how it is
us.
in Canada.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but it's like a little different. I guess we have that in Congress, but we only have really two parties in the U.S. So
right.
Congress and the Senate, and then the executive branch, the president gets to be choose his own cabinet and all that stuff. But so in Portugal, the strongest party is the Socialist Party, like straight up socialist, and they formed a government with the Communists and the Green Party. And the Green Party is like half socialist or whatever. And this is the way it's been for the last like 7 or 8 years. And in particular, with the recovery from 2008, it's been much stronger than many other comparable nations. And so like Portugal would be an example of a country that is pretty democratically socialist run, as well as, I just want to get back into the definition of socialism a little bit. And I found a particular video that's by act.tv that kind of explained this a little bit better, I thought. The way they explained it, it's a very short video. We should probably link it.
We can do it.
But there's like, so if you have the two sides, on the far, I always mix it up because I don't know, I think of, okay, so on the left, this is my left, this is your right, other people are the right. Okay, my left, it's actually from the French Revolution, I think. I read this somewhere that it was the way that people were seated somehow during the French Revolution, and the Jacobins were on the left side of the room and the like monarchists or something were on the right side. And so that's how it like this like spectrum came about, is because of the French Revolution. But anyways, and where they were seated, just like in the, that's the left and that's the right, whatever.
Interesting.
But I always think of it for some reason like reading, and like, so if you're progressing, like you would go to the right. So I always think of it that way, but whatever. Anyways, so this video, and the way this explains it, is that you have on one polar end is communism, and it's like the most, I guess, like everyone is equal, 100% communism. And then on the other side you have just like pure unregulated capitalism, like every man for himself, and probably man and probably not women, but whatever. I mean, there can be women capitalists too. This is actually a funny thing online. You can type in intersectional imperialism, and they have pretty funny memes that kind of blew my mind at the beginning. This is a little bit of a side, but it's kind of funny. And the memes were, it would say like Republicans, 100 people, the 100 wealthiest people should run the world. And then it's like socialists, that's crazy, you idiot. Like, no. And then it says Democrats, 50 of those people should be women, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Or like another one is Republicans like bomb every non-white country in the world. And then Democrats hire more LGBTQ pilots, you know?
Right.
So
Right.
this is also shows that like how a liberal and a socialist is very different, is that a socialist does think that LGBTQ people should have equal rights.
Right.
But to them, it's about much more about equality and economic equality than it is about individual identities being represented at every, which is also why like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't endorse Elizabeth Warren. She endorsed Bernie Sanders because Bernie Sanders' policies were economically much more socialist. We'll get to that in a second. It's not really social. There's actually no socialism there. But okay, so you have on one end unregulated capitalism, on the other end you have just everybody is assigned a toothbrush and you get one toothbrush for the year, you know, like just crazy communism. And so then socialism was the attempt to split the difference between, we have communism over here and then just unfettered capitalism over here. So socialism was an attempt to split the difference. And then, you know, people were like just scared of socialism basically. And so, and I mean, sure, there's something like, it's a lot like Christianity. Actually, it takes faith because it's something that hasn't existed in a way, you know, it takes some faith. You have to believe in this idea. So you have socialism, and then so to split the difference there, you had democratic socialism, especially to emphasize this is not authoritarian socialism. We want to work within the democratic process. And so they split between socialism and this unfettered capitalism. They put socialism here. And then still democratic socialism was still a little bit too much. And so they split the difference again, and that is social democracy.
Oh, okay.
And so, yeah, social democracy. And then like that is what you have in Scandinavia. It's social democracy. And like I was looking up some things like, okay, what about like the Nordic model and their socialism or whatever? And then you have like Danish people like, we're not socialist. And Swedish, Norwegian, Finnish people like, we're not socialist. And that is, and then you have the right wing like, they're not actually socialist. And they're 100% right. But then the funny thing is like, why then when Bernie Sanders proposes something that is in the Nordic model, does it get, we're going to be Venezuela, you know, it's like, he's like, you're right. Denmark is not socialist. All they have is a strong welfare state. All they have is a strong safety net. They don't allow their students to go $80,000 into debt like the U.S. does. They, instead of bombing, you know, the world, Iraq, Afghanistan, they have invested in public education. So, or I was going to say healthcare. Typically, with a socialist country, it's healthcare and education. They want to give things that everybody uses, and they don't want to allow Jeff Bezos to be $200 billion. Like he did just have he lost some money. Like it was small though in comparison. Like over COVID, he's made a whole lot. It's something like, it was like 50 billion he's made over the last 3 months, and but it dropped to like 35 or something like this.
And those numbers are so huge, like it's just hard to fathom.
Yeah,
you know, like
crazy.
It's just like as soon as you get into billions, it's like, yeah, I'm checking it out. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that good? I think that's good.
Yeah, it's good, but then it's also like Bernie Sanders had to introduce an act called the Stop Bezos Act. It was an acronym for something. But it was Stop Bezos. But he made it into an acronym. Because Amazon workers were working full time and still needed government assistance. Yeah. And so he said, we're going to create an act that says for every $1 that a full-time Amazon employee needs from the government, we're going to charge it straight back to you.
Oh,
And
interesting. That's an interesting idea.
yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing for Walmart. Walmart had like the same problem.
Because like when we look at this and we like I made the post on Facebook, which really was intended to be tongue in cheek, but I said, who do you trust, big government or big business?
Oh, yeah.
And
I
I
didn't
mean,
even
like,
look. I saw it. I just like scroll. I was like, keep
yeah, exactly. I think that's the smart thing to do. But I'm just like, I wanted to intentionally ask a stupid question so someone could look at it and say, I don't trust either. And there were a couple of people that said, I don't trust either. But it's like, okay, so we got like Jeff Bezos and his billions and billions and billions of dollars. So to go to the democratic socialist end of things, do you give that money to the government and then trust them to actually use it for programs? Like and I think that's why people always go straight to big government, because it's like, well, I think, having a collectivist mentality in saying, like, this is going to go to public education, this is going to go to healthcare. It's like, well, it's not really going to the government. It's actually going to the community. Is that kind of the way it's reframed?
Yes. And if you read, like we talked about last time, if you read leftist literature, I'll just say leftist, progressive, socialist, whatever, especially socialist, if you get like, a little bit beyond the liberal thing, they're very critical of the government. And it's like, if the government doesn't work for the people, then they're like, get rid of it. And, there is like probably the most common like radical position is anarcho-communism. And so the anarcho part means anarchist. And anarchists say if it's an unjust system, it has to go. It's gone.
Right.
So, and that to them is the government, and that is like a goal of, this. But there's the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that if socialism is the workers owning the means of production, no one is advocating that right now. Like there is no one on any kind of level that's actually advocating for that. I think the vast majority of people agree, like they don't like the system the way it is now, but they want it to gradually change. They don't, vast majority of people. I mean, I'm trying to think, like 5%. I think if you like, find some like almost homeless 25-year-old person, slap him in the face and like spray him with tear gas and be like, what do you want to do? If you do that, then they're going to like say like, I want everything to blow up,
Yeah.
And then you have, your like Fox News segment, you're like, Antifa supporter wants to destroy everything and burn down the police department. And this is a minority of people that doesn't even, I mean, there's just a stat came out. I think it's like 95% of the BLM protests were peaceful. This is like a recent one. It might've been like 93, 95. I didn't click on all the articles I saw.
I think I saw 95 as well. And I mean, this is the crazy thing though, right? We live in a society where it's like, by and large, so like my Facebook demographic, it's like so many of these people are just like, I don't trust the media. And it's like, okay, so what are you talking about here? You're talking about any mainstream service or media except for Fox News, which then leaves you with, I trust Fox News and independent news sources. And I'm like, okay, so what is Fox News? What's their incentive to report the truth? These independent news sources, as far as I can tell, most of them are incentivized to figure out what's the best clickbait to actually start making money. And so it's like, I think honestly, we need to look at the media like we look at people. And like when my buddy says to me, hey, all of this is fake, I look at him and I think about, what has he told me in the past? How trustworthy is what he's saying? Like there's all these things. And it's like, you don't blindly follow anybody. You don't blindly.
Right. Yeah, totally.
And I'm like, you could treat the media the same way you do human beings and look at their incentives. And I mean, there's this right-wing news source in Canada, the Rebel News. I was just listening to their podcast today, and it was, ridiculous. But it's like, this is like kind of like the Canadian equivalent of Breitbart. I know, like, it was like probably a year ago or 2 years ago. It was about, no, I think it was a year ago. Man, time flies fast. A year ago, they were talking about how, like, our prime minister had groped a woman at like a event, way back
Trudeau.
when.
It wasn't Trudeau.
It was Trudeau, yeah. So
Trudeau,
he has a history of groping a woman, and it goes back to like 2003. He's like this in his early 20s. He's like the son of a famous prime minister, and so there was a little bit of entitlement, I think, going on there. And he did this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I read this on their news service, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't know how true this is. But then I saw the CBC, which is very friendly to Justin Trudeau, post the same story. And I'm like, okay, this happened. Because like the CBC does not have incentive to attack this guy.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think that, like, and so when we talk about 95% peaceful, I'm looking at that and I'm saying, okay, well, they're at least admitting there's 5% that are violent. And then when we look at what's getting played from kind of Trump Central, it's that 5% that they're repeating it. And they keep calling them anarchists, which I'm like, I don't think you guys know what anarchy is.
It's the same thing they did with immigrants too. Like they were saying, oh, we're letting in all these, rapists and MS-13. And then, they went through the numbers and it was like something like, I don't remember the numbers of immigrants, but of the immigrants that came in, it was like 5 had possible ties to the MS-13. It was like their cousin, was a member or something like that.
Yeah.
And then 2 out of, I want to say it was like 2 million, or it was a big number. And it's like, and then I think there was the example like, well, what if I have a bowl of Skittles and I say only 2 of these are poisonous? It's like, and that's why it's frustrating, is because, okay, like 2 of the Skittles out of the like, massive number, whatever it was, of immigrants, 2 of them are MS-13, and we don't want MS-13 in the US, but then like, this is such like a myopic focus that,
well, and I mean, all of these analogies, that people like to use to simplify an issue don't work, because it's like, well, it's simple. I don't need to eat the Skittles. Right?
Yeah.
But it's like, but what if the Skittles are possibly going to die if you don't, like, it's like, and I all of this is just complicated stuff. So we kind of take this like idea of workers owning the means of production and giving the workers more power so that they can make decisions that are more fair for everyone. And I like, the McCormick kind of story that you told me, and looking at that, and then thinking about like, where we've got all these workers who are being told, you know what, I'm just going to lay off half of you instead of allowing you to only work 8 hours a day. I want to have half of you working 10 hours a day. And then, like, so when we talk about kind of like, if we gave the workers more power and we had like a worker co-op, like that bike,
bike shops.
The bike shop where it's like everybody owns the business. It's like, well, that's much better. Like less people get mistreated. And so,
and that's the thing. Like I was reading, some of these, I got a little deeper into the worker co-op thing, and Reagan actually talked about this kind of stuff. And it really is not that crazy. And I think most people are like, worker-owned co-op, that seems cool. Why not? And I dug into it a little bit more. There's, I don't know, the example that I had known from before, I forget where I found it, but it's this bakery in Northern California called the Alvarado Street Bakery. And they pay their workers on the assembly line $65,000 a year.
Wow.
And I don't know if it's on top of that or if it's including that, but like they have all their salaries like set basically, and then whatever they earn beyond that is a gain share. And I guess they publish it every quarter, and they give it to all their people, and they say like, oh yeah, you can just divide that by 113 and you're going to get that bonus because like we had that much profit and you own the place, so you get it. And everybody actually from the gain share, everybody gets it totally equal. Also, it's like totally split as 130. So the CEO gets the same bonus as the person who puts the bread in the bag, you know?
So it's kind of like you've got a like socialist microcosm within a capitalistic society, right?
Totally.
And so you got the profits of a capitalistic society, but then you've taken it and you've split it evenly so it becomes socialistic.
Totally. And that is like, you have Richard Wolff, the Marxist professor. Wow. His big thing right now is democracy at work. He's trying to like help people set up co-ops. Like,
that's good.
How evil, like, is he has Cornel West on, who's clearly a revolutionary Christian. They talk about Martin Luther King. There's no like the Soviet Union and Marx. It's very interesting because Marx was actually like a biblical scholar. The first thing that he wrote was about the Bible.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, his first thing was with this guy Bruno Bauer, and I mean, they get a bad name, but it's complicated. And I really want to write about this. If I do a PhD, I kind of want it to be about this. Was about the biblical studies of the early socialists, because people don't talk about that, but all of them were actually biblical studies people. And they just realized that the Eurocentric model of Christianity was wrong. It wasn't even biblical. And Martin Luther was kind of the beginning of this, to say like, you can't sell salvation. And we should have the Bible in normal people's languages. And so then they, in a way, they kind of just kept going from Martin Luther to the point that, but the church was so against like actually helping poor people. Vincent van Gogh is another example of this around the same time period. I can't remember do you know his time period? I think it's the same, but he was a pastor, Vincent van Gogh, and he was given, or a priest, and I think he was Catholic. Oh, gosh, I should know this. I read a book about him recently. But he gave his, he had a big house. They like gave him a big house as a part of being a priest, pastor, whatever. And he gave it to homeless people. And the church didn't like that. And so he ended up getting fired from the church because he gave his place to homeless people. And he like slept in a barn. He said, I don't need this place. I'm going to give it to them. I'm going to go sleep in this barn. And they didn't like that. And so he lived this like, tortured genius life. And probably he didn't kill himself. Probably someone shot him and he didn't tell people that another person shot him. He got shot in the stomach and it went down as like a suicide, but it's like almost for sure that someone else shot him, but he wouldn't say.
Wow.
Like he lived like 3 or 4 days with like having been shot in the stomach and died from that.
Wow.
All that aside, I feel like we should get back to historical examples.
Yeah. No, it's good.
So I talked about Portugal and I talked about the Nordic model, which is true. It's not really socialism, but then I'm like, so why do we call healthcare for all socialism then? Why do we call like, just running through examples, Social Security was called socialism. In 1961, Medicare was being proposed, and Ronald Reagan, the young Ronald Reagan, gave a speech saying, if we allow this Medicare, not for all, just regular Medicare as it exists in the United States, I think you have to be over 65. I'm not sure if that's how it was in 1960. 1966 is when it came into law. But in 1961, Reagan gave a speech saying, if we allow Medicare, it's going to bring in a socialist dictatorship. Like, okay, socialism is workers owning the means of production. providing a healthcare system that works for everybody is not socialism. It's like maybe on the way, but I mean, we can care about people. It's okay. It's okay to care about people. It's okay for like Jeff Bezos to pay some taxes. So, but historical examples, workers owning the means of production has only happened on a small scale. And like Alvarado Street Bakery, where the workers make $65,000 and get the same end of the year bonus as the CEO. Like the Soviet Union, this was, I discovered some things about the Soviet Union. People make the big deal about private property and stuff. The Soviet Union actually gave people property. So like when they had their revolution and they kind of threw out something like the Tsar and all this stuff, they gave private property to a whole bunch of individuals. So it's like they were not anti-private property. Later, I guess they maybe took some of it back. And, not like praising the Soviet Union here. Very few people, the people that do praise the Soviet Union are called tankies online. So if you see like somebody get called a tanky, it's pretty rare that someone identifies as a tanky, but someone will be like, oh my gosh, you're a tanky. And it means like they literally want to, well, very few people actually act on this, but that they're all actually violent. Or there's also Maoist is like the most kind of intense version of socialist. And there's like a very famous French philosopher named Alain Badiou, who was a Maoist, but has actually switched, and he's been writing books about Paul and love. And he's kind of like gone back on his previous Maoism. So there's not that many Maoists and not that many tankies or Stalinists.
And both of those would be really about state control of everything, right?
Yes, technically it's a transitional phase. And so that's why the Soviet Union was not socialist, actually, because workers did not own the means of production. The state owned the means of production.
Right.
And officially the goal was, because really you can't just hand over a factory to all the workers. Like you kind of have to have some education, some like experience, and like socialists, 90% of socialists know this. And this is why no one's actually advocating for actual workers owning the means of productions immediately. They want to head that direction, but it's like, I think probably it's like 20 or 30 years at the quickest, I don't think it's very, very few. And Bernie Sanders in particular, people asked him, so do you want workers to own the means of production? And he's like, no. He said this on a number of occasions, like, no. So then this actually disqualifies him from the label democratic socialism, because it's not socialism.
Right.
It's social democracy, what you see in the Nordics, which, is exactly as right-wing people have rightly claimed this is not socialism. It's not. So stop calling Medicare for all socialism. Historical examples. We're trying to get to historical examples. The Soviet Union, interestingly, did not, or they gave private property. They weren't against private property. They gave it. They created more private property people. And I mentioned Portugal. Venezuela is interesting. I kind of don't want to talk about that right now, but a lot of the consensus is that they were super reliant on oil. And why were they super reliant on oil is because they were kind of an informal US colony for like most of their existence. And so they became, like, the US wanted them to be an exporter of oil. But then I think it was in like 99 or something. I'm off on these numbers, I'm sure. But Hugo Chavez, basically, the relationship soured because of the United States' the way that they were treating many, many Latin American countries. And so the US was like, well, then we're not going to buy the oil anymore. And they're like, well, fine, we'll sell it to other people. And then the US said, okay, if anybody buys oil from Venezuela, we're going to put sanctions on you too. And it just became this like massive so Venezuela had no countries to work with, and they had like 90% of their economy was reliant on oil. And I think there was a point, like in the 80s or 90s when oil prices dropped. And so that was like real crappy for Venezuela, but it was kind of like the way the cards fell and a consequence of being an informal colony of the United States. And so they tried to make it out, and, the U.S. continues to try to push them into a place where they have to become an informal colony of the United States again. And have they done everything perfect? Absolutely not. So we'll just.
So basically, you cannot explain their whole downfall and their difficulties in terms of socialism, like many people would want you to say, right?
Yeah, and I think we have, this very vague concept of socialism. It's just everything that I don't like is socialism.
Yeah, pretty much.
So we'll keep going. But yeah, one issue is so then why are there not more examples of socialism is basically the question that I was headed towards. And a big reason is that the United States intervened every time something started to start working. It intervened. And so you have Indonesia was happening about the same time as Vietnam. And the US basically said, there was a guy in power named Sukarno, and the US said, we will not be assisting you, we won't work with you unless Sukarno is gone, because Sukarno was favorable to communists, and communists, their goal was to eliminate poverty. Their goal was to they didn't want to sell their resources to a foreign power. They wanted to make their resources in such a way that helped all of the nation, as opposed to just a few people.
Right.
Like Saudi Arabia was there's just a few people, the traditional tribe of Saudi Arabia, we own the oil and we'll sell it to you basically at the prices you want. And the 1,000 of us will be super wealthy. And 1,000 there's much more people than that, but
yeah, exactly.
But this small group will be super wealthy, and we'll sell the oil whatever price you want. So the U.S. loves that about Saudi Arabia.
Right.
But Iraq didn't do that. Iraq said, we want our oil to benefit, and not really all of Iraq. I mean, there's you can't defend Saddam Hussein really. In some ways, though, some surprising ways you can. He was very kind to the Christians. Interesting. I was there. I was in Iraq for 2 months, and I met a ton of Iraqi Christians who are incredible historical. The historical Christianity in Iraq is the most historical Christianity there is, actually. They speak the same language as Jesus, Aramaic. It's crazy. And they never became oppressive or violent, these Iraqi Christians, throughout their 2,000 years of history. It's really incredible. Look them up. It's called the Assyrian Church of the East. It's the really incredible version. But I asked the Christians, I was like, so when was the good time for you? And they're like, Saddam Hussein. And you're like, what?
That's insane.
Wasn't he an evil dictator? And they're like, well, if you were a leftist, well, actually, no, it wasn't even leftist. It was a particular version of Kurdish that Saddam treated really badly. But everyone else, he kept the peace, and especially for the Christians, he really took care of the Christians, actually. Yeah, and so they all speak very highly of Saddam Hussein. The Christians do, and I shouldn't say all. Now some have been bought out by the United States. But Saddam wanted to nationalize the oil. And so that meant that whatever oil companies that the U.S. was going to, the way that the U.S. was going to buy the oil was going to have to be basically they were going to have to work with a workers' union. And they would much rather work with a few CEOs than work with a workers' union.
Right.
And so this is what created a big problem with George Bush Sr. and then going to the point where somehow we blamed terrorism on Iraq when 18 of the 21 attackers came from Saudi Arabia.
Hmm.
Just doesn't. And then they said they had weapons of mass destruction, but they didn't.
Hmm.
We have this big problem. Anyways, but Saddam was actually, on paper, he was a socialist. So Chile is a really good example, and it was in the 70s. They had a very chill. I don't know, chill. I'm from California. I use these words, chill. They had a very easy, democratically elected socialist named Salvador Allende, and Salvador Allende wanted to basically fight poverty and lift the workers up, and really benefit the people of Chile. But the U.S. didn't like this, and the U.S. was very concerned that if if this model worked in Chile, then it was going to spread. So they basically orchestrated an assassination, and they assassinated Salvador Allende and installed this guy Pinochet. And Pinochet was a dictator. It's very classic. They went in, took out the democratically elected person, and then installed their puppet dictator, Pinochet. And it's shocking. And they tried to do the same thing throughout the world, but especially Latin America. And where I kind of had my political, I don't know, I guess, growth with socialism was in Nicaragua. And I went to Nicaragua. I built a house with a friend there. It was his property. He owns the land. And we built this little small 2-room house on the beach, pretty much. Super cool. Really cheap, because communists create cheap, affordable living, cost of living. And so we built this house, and then for a month I went and bought a motorcycle for $1,000, and I took it all over Nicaragua. Ended up staying with these people in the mountains of Miraflor. It's in the north part of Nicaragua, and everybody there, they ask, of course, where are you from? Where are you from? Oh, I'm from the US. And oh, and they're like, that's okay. We know that you're not like Ronald Reagan, And
Wow.
I'm what do you what do you mean? And so I started asking more questions, and I started to realize, for them, Ronald Reagan they talk about Reagan the same way that we talk about Hitler.
Wow.
Because I stayed with this family, and they were super devout Christians, Catholic. I mean, so in the evangelical world, we have questions about Catholics. We think that they worship idols, but this was really not the case. I've spent much more time with Catholics, and I've realized this is not really the case. But they had, we prayed before every meal, and they were very devout. And you see signs everywhere, actually. In Nicaragua, they say socialist, Christian, unified. And it's not saying exactly that those two, but it's solidarity, I guess. Christian, socialist, solidarity. And it's solidarity with the people. Theirs is a Christian socialism, at least on paper anyways. Not everybody's really acting it out, but so for them, Christian socialism, and I was like, I thought you couldn't be a Christian and a socialist, but here they are. And then I stayed with this family, and this guy shows me yeah, he had been shot right here. And I'm like, whoa, when did you get shot? And he's like, well, in the 80s, when the Contras, once a year for 10 years, they would come and attack our village. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Turns out Ronald Reagan illegally sold weapons to Iran, and he used that money to fund an opposition to the Nicaraguan socialist government. And the history of Nicaragua is crazy. A lot of backstory. The U.S. is way involved, but in I think 35 until it was 1980 or something, right around there. From 1935 to about 1980, this Somoza family was in charge, dictatorship, not very democratic, pretty much fascist. And they were basically selling off land to, especially the United States, to do whatever they wanted. So the U.S. was getting a lot of lumber from there. In the 1970s, almost all the beef in the United States, well, not all, Um, it must have been a majority. I read this somewhere, but it's the majority of beef from Nicaragua was going to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the U.S. was just like really liking that they could buy all this, and the Somozas were just selling it off like crazy, but not treating people very well. So the people, actually, there's a big earthquake in like '78 or something, and the Sandinistas. This is cutting out a ton of history, but the Sandinistas were a basically Marxist, socialist, whatever organization, and they overthrew this dictator. And the U.S. kind of didn't know what to do because they had been supporting the Somozas. They had been, we had been buying a lot of wood and a lot of beef, especially from the Somozas. And they didn't really know what to do. Like, are we supposed to fund like the Somozas and keep them around? They tried to kind of save the guy actually, as he fled, but it didn't work. He went to Argentina and was like killed by workers in Argentina.
Wow.
But the Sandinistas took charge and nobody really knew what to do. And Jimmy Carter kind of like gave them the basic amount of like kind of humanitarian aid because this earthquake had destroyed a whole bunch of infrastructure.
Right.
But then when Ronald Reagan got in charge, he was like, no way are we supporting these people because they are connected to Russia and Cuba. And so then when that happened, basically the Sandinistas did go totally Russia and Cuba, and they were pretty upset at the United States for like supporting the Somozas and all this stuff.
Right.
But then what Reagan did is he started doing all these maneuvers like what's called the Iran-Contra scandal. People can look it up. And he sold weapons to Iran, which is super weird because Iran was an enemy too, but it was all illegal, and it was all like not talked about until all of a sudden it blew up. But it wasn't big enough because I guess US American people didn't care that much. But he started sending for like 10 years. Basically, he funded this anti-Sandinista group called the Contras, and it was like Hondurans and like people who were sympathetic to Somoza, the previous dictator. And they were going in and basically attacking the people in Nicaragua, terrorizing them. And the thing was, Reagan basically said, and it became the U.S. It was actually like in '94 or something, '92. But they said if you elect Violeta, which is a woman leader, then all the war will stop. And because the U.S. was funding the war against Nicaragua, and so actually Violeta won the election, and she ran the place for like 4 years, and then the next election they voted in the socialist from before, named Daniel Ortega, who's currently maybe in corruption stuff. So he's not like the perfect person ever. But he basically resisted the U.S. And the U.S. he had Ernesto Cardenal was a big person who was a Christian that was involved in that. Thomas Merton was really good friends with Ernesto Cardenal. So it was actually a very Christian-friendly socialism that was in Nicaragua. But the U.S. was so anti this, and so many people died as a result. And what was the socialism that they were advocating was merely like farmers' co-ops. When I was there, there's socialists today, especially in this like northern part of Nicaragua. And the guy that I stayed with is the Christian who runs the farmer co-op. And he shows me, yeah, they shot me right here. And he told me this whole story about it. And
wow.
And it's so idyllic. It's like literally like the Shire. They have solar panels that the Germans donated to them. And they have a coffee farm that they sell coffee to people around the world. But then mostly they just have these farms and they share their produce, and it's like really idyllic. They don't have running water. But their house is like an old ranch, and it's totally clean and incredible. Yeah, really incredible experience to meet with them and then to experience and read a little bit more about that whole process. And the way the United States treated these Christians was real bad. After Violetta her time, basically the US gave up. I think it was like Bill Clinton's time, and they're just like, you know what, forget it. We're not like as anti-communist as we used to be. Like, you guys can just do whatever you want. And they've kind of moderated out, and they were kind of, moderated. There's issues, especially recently. There's more issues. I think they want it to be more capitalist than it is. The people do. So there's issues right now. But so there's three things that I wanted to talk about before we finish. One was Nicaragua, and there's a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman that describes the way that the U.S. treats a lot of these countries. And this is really why there aren't so many examples of workers owning the means of production, is because every time they start to try, the U.S., like in Vietnam, like in Nicaragua, like in Chile, like in Iraq, even Venezuela, like they were subject to all these embargoes and things. So there hasn't been much of an opportunity, is because the last like 40, 50 years, the U.S. is just, in Bolivia, it just happened. The democratically elected person was basically just ousted by the U.S. And actually, maybe Elon Musk was connected to this, because there's a lot of lithium in Bolivia, and they want lithium for car batteries. So anyways, we can edit and cut it out or keep it. But Solar City, I worked for Elon Musk for a while, and I thought this just kind of shows a little bit of the problem with capitalism and why we would need a social democracy, because I'm really not, I don't think anybody's advocating for workers owning the means of production on a massive scale immediately.
Right.
But with Solar City, this is Elon Musk Corporation, and there's different versions of workers owning the means of production. One is called ESOP, Employee Shared Ownership Program. And basically they give stocks to employees. And Solar City actually had a version of this. When I first signed up, they were like, oh yeah, we're going to give you 25 stocks when you sign up. And I was like, oh, cool. That seems great. And a couple of my friends were like, yeah, dude, like just sign up and work for them for a month and then just sell your stocks afterwards. You'll make like a few $1,000s. Just super easy. I was like, okay. And that's actually like kind of what tipped me over to like working for Solar City. They started me at $14 an hour. I was a junior installer, and they were going to give me 25 shares of stock. But then after a month, they were like, oh, but they have to be vested before they're actually yours. And I was like, oh, what? But I was kind of already bought into the system of Solar City, so I kept working. And then they pay me $14 an hour, but you get panel pay. And so panel pay, if you installed a lot of solar panels, then you could make more. And so we made like $25 to $30 an hour sometimes. That would be a really good week if we made that much. But what happened with panel pay also is that like we started to get good. And when we started to get good, they dropped the panel pay. And so it actually, like, we were starting to make, that 25 or 30, and you had to get good jobs as well. The better, if you got like a really easy job, then you could knock it out real fast. But sometimes more jobs were more complex and they took much longer.
Was this at residences or?
At first it was at residences. I worked in every capacity. So residences, commercial and military. I worked for them for 2 years. And I got a couple of raises, promotions. So I started at 14, but it's $1 an hour or more. So my promotion from junior installer to regular installer was $14 to $15 an hour. And then from regular installer to senior installer was $16 an hour. But you get panel pay. But the problem is that about a year in, they changed the panel pay so that you couldn't reach the big bucks anymore. But then I got on what's called a prevailing wage job. Have you heard of that? Is that a thing?
No, I haven't. No, I'm not, so as far as I know.
It's a government job, and what they do is they do studies on the area, and they say, okay, the workers have to be paid this much money. And when we first got there, it was $38 an hour. But they didn't tell us. And so we went down and just like clocked in the way we always did in our normal clocking in. And it was like, we worked for like 2 weeks on this, like I was getting paid 14 an hour or 15 probably at that point. I was getting paid 15 an hour. And then another worker told us to, like, from somewhere else, because it was all these traveling crews and traveling workers. And they said, yo, don't clock in regular, clock in under this thing. You call it laborer. And so they were like, okay. And we clocked in labor, and like, yeah, dude, you're going to get paid way more. And we're like, really? Okay. And so we did this, we clocked in laborer, and then all of a sudden we're making $38 an hour. And we're like, what? This is crazy. And we had about a month of that before they sat us down and they said, hey, so yeah, actually, you guys aren't laborers, you're commercial electricians. You're not allowed to clock in a laborer anymore. And we're all like, oh, okay. And I can't remember what they said, how they justified it, but basically they said you're commercial electricians, and commercial electricians were getting paid $27 an hour. So we got dropped, but that was still kind of better than average. So we didn't really complain, and we had no like bargaining or whatever, but they dropped our pay by, $11 an hour. And right after that, the guy who was running the project, he was only there for like 2 weeks after that. And then he quit the job. And come to find out is that they have like a budget or whatever. And if whatever they don't spend of the budget, they get like 25% of that.
Oh.
And so what this guy did is he figured out how to drop, and there was like 100 and something of us working there. So they're paying 100 and something of us $38 an hour, and they dropped us $11 an hour, $27 an hour. So he saved a ton of money, and his bonus then was probably astronomical. So he got the bonus and he quit. And basically, I mean, with Elon Musk, it's total capitalist thing. It's the goal is to lower the cost of labor.
Right.
And we had no bargaining power. Those 25 stocks that I was promised at the beginning, I worked there for 2 years. I only ended up getting 7 of them because it would take 4 years for all 25 to vest. And I worked 2.
What do they mean by vest? It's like, or do you understand it? You just know that it didn't go in until.
Yeah, that was the word they used. I don't know. I never
that's crazy.
Got so far into it. But yeah, my stocks didn't vest. And then you also have, like, recently with Tesla, he also cut he sent everybody home, which is understandable. Like, okay. But the workers who stayed, he cut their pay by 10%. This is over COVID. And he himself has made $40 billion over coronavirus.
Yeah.
And so this model has a problem in it's not incentivized in caring about workers.
No.
And so this is the problem where it's like, okay, if we want capitalism, we have to fix this problem that it always wants to get rid of the workers. It always wants to drop the pay of the workers.
Totally.
And that is, I was a libertarian for 10 years, but once I got that concept, I was like, oh, libertarianism does nothing for this. It's like, trust Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk to pay their workers a decent wage. But then it runs into the same problem that I hear so often, the human nature thing. Well, socialism doesn't work because of human nature. And it's like, capitalism doesn't work because of human nature.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, and now we have the situation where in the last 30 years, the top 1% has made $21 trillion. And the top 50% is in the United States, or the bottom 50%, has lost 900 billion. So it's the wealth inequality that's driving a frustration with the system the way it is. And this is a problem that is persistent with capitalism, but Bezos, Musk, and basically the 1% they want more and more and more and more.
Right.
And there's no incentive except that their system's going to fall apart. But Gandhi said, we have enough for everybody's need, but we don't have enough for everybody's greed.
Right.
So, and then that brings me to the last point, I guess, and I saw a few people referencing this, and I think it's a good question, because they'll say, what about individual rights? What about, because individual versus the collectivist? And the thing to ask is, which individual are you talking about? Are you talking about the workers? You're not talking about the workers, because when I first discovered this, I was reading J. Gresham Machen, who, like, if anybody knows, it's from 1923. He wrote a book called Christianity and Liberalism. And he's really upset with liberalism, saying this is not Christianity because it's leaving the door open to creeping socialism that's infringing on individual rights. He wrote that in 1923, and I was like, wait a minute. Women got the right to vote in 1920. And he was saying this recent infringing on individual rights. Women got the right to vote in 1920. And I'm like, that's a big moment for individual rights, women getting rights. Yeah. And just before that, African Americans had started going to college for the first time, ever. And so I was like, I wonder, okay, I'm going to look it up. What was Machen's stance on African Americans in going to college, and what was his stance on women voting? Against both of it. Yeah. Both of them. So, like, which individual rights are you talking about here? You're talking about his own, he's like, he has to have competition all of a sudden. This is what he's upset about. Mm-hmm. There's a quote, unattributed, but it's like, it's like, you're losing privilege and calling it oppression. Right. And so it's like, which individual rights are you talking about? Because you're not talking about African Americans and you're not talking about women. So, like, you're talking about your privileged position is what you're talking about. And so I have a book by John Dewey, one of the most famous American intellectuals. And he has this argument. He was a democratic socialist, reformer of education. And he has this thing, individualism, old and new. And he says, we need a foundation for the individual to spring from, because right now we have a whole bunch of individuals who do not get a chance at individual rights. And so we have to build a society that allows individuals to have rights. And I think he was writing in like the 30s or something when that came out, 20s maybe. But so the question is just which individual? And I would argue that under capitalism, maybe you start, it just degenerates. It degenerates constantly unless you put some regulations on it. So the socialism that I'm advocating is really not socialism yet. I mean, maybe one day, like in 30 years from now, if we've like progressed that far, maybe then I'll advocate for actual socialism. Yeah. But for me right now, it's a strong social safety net and it's worker-owned co-ops. That's what I'm advocating. And Biden's not going to do it, by the way. Biden is like, Biden is the nerdiest centrist. Like, and even Bernie is like, well, he would do the things that I was talking about, but the safety net, he would attempt those things, but he still has 50% of the United States that, well, actually, Medicare for All has huge support, and all his policies have huge support. It's just the name. Socialism is like some boogeyman term, It is. So. Well, thank you, Taylor. Sorry, I learned a lot again. Yeah. And yeah, for sure. I'm sure we'll have more to discuss at another date, and we'll have you on again. Sounds good. Thanks for having me, man. And I guess we'll put the same links we did in the last episode. Mm-hmm. And to get a hold of Taylor, and we'll see you again. Vielen Dank, mein Bruder.
Air Smudge.